August 1943. The world is at war. Japan is engaged in combat with the behemoth that is the United States. And although the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had more than a few decisive victories during the first few months post-Pearl Harbor, by this point in the war, it was becoming quite clear that the US and its allies were not to be trifled with. In fact, by this point, it was more or less a losing war. All that has been said so far is not unlike our own universe. However, things are slightly different here. The technology in the Nobunaga Universe is much further ahead of our own. About 100 extra years of advancements in diesel-based technology, along with the advent of the transistor in 1924, has completely changed the landscape of war. The US, with its abundance of natural resources and strong ties to other allied nations, was able to fight with perhaps 50% less manpower than it would have otherwise. Machines, powered by a newly developed artificial intelligence system, took care of the rest. Japan, however, is not so lucky. It does not have a steady supply of resources at its hands. It cannot build these complex machines, at least not to a capacity to make a difference. It instead needs to fight a conventional war, fully run by humans. The Japanese government predicted that by August of 1944, even with the conscription system in place, it would have almost completely run out of healthy fighting men. Things were getting desperate. In comes a man by the name of Hachizume Noofumi, aged 34. He has no background in war. In fact, he would often faint at the sight of blood. But he had a keen sense for making money, as did the rest of his kin, being the son of a Zaibutsu family, and he sensed an opportunity. He came up with an idea that would have rippling effects throughout the rest of Japan's modern history. Japan was lacking men, but it was also lacking infrastructure. Buildings. See, the US did a number of bombings in Japan's major cities, faster than Japan could rebuild, and hundreds of thousands of families suddenly found themselves without homes. But correctional facilities were not often targeted. They were isolated from dense population hubs and were easily identifiable by Allied aircraft. They simply weren't worth the bombs, so they stayed relatively safe. Hachizume's solution was simple. These prisons were full of able-bodied men. If the government were to take these men, they could use them for war, and these now empty buildings could be used to house Japan's displaced population. Two birds with one stone. It should also be noted that most of Japan's prisons were privately owned by Hachizume's family. It would be receiving a lot of funding from this project. Convenient. There was an old law in place, however, from the time of Meiji, often dubbed the Honor Law, that forbade the government from forcefully conscripting prisoners. This would have to be a purely volunteer effort. The government offered any first-time offenders, no matter how violent the crime, guaranteed freedom after the war, on the condition that Japan won. Second-time offenders and up could have their sentences reduced by up to 75%, and those sentenced to life would only have to serve 10 years after the war. What the government didn't tell them is that they fully expected them to die in the war, and thus weren't likely to reap these rewards. But that didn't stop this plan from being a success. Men registered in droves. Though they fought valiantly, Japan still ultimately lost the war. But this video is not about those men. It's about the buildings they left behind, the institutions. These abandoned prisons were now ready to be used by Japan's displaced population. However, there was a catch. They could only be used by women and children. Men were not allowed. This policy was put into place because the government viewed displaced men as another resource for the war. They wanted them as uncomfortable as possible so that they would register for the war out of desperation. No need to even be conscripted. Not that the institutions were very comfortable to begin with. These were repurposed prisons after all. Personal comfort wasn't the highest priority when they were designed, and there were no efforts put into place to make them more comfortable either. This was partially because Japan didn't have the money and resources to remodel them, and partially because the Japanese government didn't want Allied intelligence to catch on to this plan. If tons of construction projects suddenly appeared around these buildings, it would look very suspicious. They needed to remain mostly the same out of necessity. Thus, women and children were forced to live in nearly the same conditions as the prisoners before them, which was perhaps still a step above total homelessness, but only by so much. To make matters worse, most of the staff of these institutions were the correctional officers that already worked there. They knew the layout of these buildings, and they were the only labor available. They weren't, however, trained to handle these new civilians. Out of war fatigue, or perhaps lack of care, they went back to the prison training, which did not go over well. Moreover, not every prisoner volunteered for the war. Some were disabled, some were too old, and others refused to volunteer on principle. So, they stayed in the institutions. They were zoned off from the civilian population, but the civilians did not at all feel comfortable having to live so close to potentially dangerous people. Their fears were not unwarranted either. There were more than a few instances when a prisoner snuck their way into a civilian zone and committed murder, or worse. After the war, many institutions continued to be occupied by the civilians, who still had nowhere to go. Its inhabitants, broken by the war, became easy targets for the fatherless children. Particularly easy targets were the institution kids. These were people born in the institution. For them, this was all that they knew. Over time, most of the civilian population moved to more traditional housing projects, and the buildings were returned back to regular prisons. Many buildings remain abandoned to this day. Entire populations of prisoners had died in the war, and Japan suddenly had more prisons than it had prisoners. These buildings simply lost their use. There is one notable exception, a prison operated entirely by the major gangs of the capital. However, that one deserves special coverage, perhaps another time. The institution system may be officially over, but its presence can still be felt. It only ended 4 years before the time of our series. The wounds are still fresh. In time, justice may be served, reparations for all harm caused, but well, the population isn't waiting with bated breath.